Well, it can be joyous to know that you're that you can be a larger character than you ever thought you might be. Large, I mean that you can occupy more space.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My conversation this week is with a friend of mine and a former professor of mine, Brian Smith, from the University of Calgary in the Department of Drama. He was an acting teacher for me, and he continues to do work as he splits time between Toronto and Nova Scotia. He's a really fascinating person, and I've always wanted to sit down for an hour to chat with him about his ideas of acting, theatre, and, most important, creativity, and how creativity is a meeting place between the private and the public, between the inner life and the outer life. We talk about this as well as other things to do with creativity, the idea of playfulness and collaboration, problem solving, and the importance of obstacles, as well as idleness. We pivot to technology and Brian's journey with cancer over the past year, before we talk about the question that is asked very often on this show: is it better to know or not to know? We talk about Brian's continuing role as a teacher and his affinity for masks and mask work. Finally, we talk about how theater is important to dissolve barriers between us. All of this is coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Now, if you like this show, please give it a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use, and go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes and let me know what you think of any of those episodes, as well as give me your suggestions for future guests and future ideas and topics to be discussed on this show. Brian Smith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having the time to do this. I'm really excited to have you here.
Good to be here.
So, full disclosure, you're a former professor of mine in the Department of Drama at the University of Calgary, and that was 15 years ago that we worked together back there. And because of my experience with you in theater and the work that we did together, and the work that you obviously did as a teacher of mine in theater, I've been excited to have this podcast with you for a long time, and you're one of the most exciting guests that I have. And you may not,
no pressure.
No pressure, Brian. Don't feel like you have to own the show or anything or put on a performance. But the reason I say that is because I have always found you not only really interesting about the things that you do and talk about, but also I've learned a lot. And I think that the things that we've talked about in the past and the great conversations that we've had since I worked under you in the theater have made me think a lot, and I think other people could learn a lot from them as well. So again, thank you for coming.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be with you.
So I've got the first question for you, and it's always the same, and you can answer it as broadly as you wish. And here we go, Brian. What on earth is going on?
Well, for me, a lot of reflection. And I suppose that's partly the result of where I am in my own life's journey. But maybe it's also a response to what I feel around me, which is a sensation that change is happening very rapidly. The world is moving very quickly, and the planet is becoming overpopulated and stressed, and there's a sense, I think, politically of in the world of fragmentation, and maybe underlying that a yearning for some kind of unity, all of which together perhaps makes me want to spend quite a bit of time in a quiet place, reflecting on my experience and, well, the biography that I've created for myself in this world.
Do you think that that's a healthy response to take to the accelerations that are occurring in our world, politically, culturally, technologically? Do you think that to find a quiet place is not just a healthy response, but almost a necessary one sometimes?
Well, for me it is. One aspect of my quiet place is going back to northern Nova Scotia, where I was born and where I haven't lived for many years, but I now have a place there. And so my family and I, we spend time there. And that's a quiet place. And it's a place that also connects me with my roots, with my beginnings. And therefore it confirms certain things for me that are important, I think.
Is there a connection between quiet and creativity, between reflection and the pause of life, right? Not just the constant hustle, bustle, and go, but the time we have to take to pause. Is that a part of creativity, or is it relevant only when it needs to be?
Well, creativity is a loaded concept, and it's not the exclusive domain of any particular discipline or endeavor. And different individuals and I suppose different constituencies might use the word and think about the word in quite different ways. There's a push and a pull to this. I think that in order to be creative, yes, one needs a kind of freedom, which you can think of spatially. One needs a creative space in which to create, a space in which, one isn't constantly perhaps bombarded by distraction or, dissonance that's going to work against your creativity. On the other hand, people might argue that creativity is the result of playfulness. It's the result of, and often the result of collaborating with others, playing with others. And so the private and both the private and the communal aspects of creativity need to be considered when you think about the question you just asked.
Well, and there's another thing too, and I think it's maybe related or maybe a category of these things, but that creativity is often a response to obstacles. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that we need a space to be free, mm-hmm. and that creativity is also a sense of playfulness, and maybe that's another way of saying that we use creativity when we encounter something we don't know how to overcome yet. That's right. An obstacle that maybe we have maybe a knowledge passed down to us about how to overcome it, but maybe we need to find a quicker way. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I've never had this rock in my path before. What do I do? And creativity is simply the problem solving around it. And when we talk about artistic creativity, sometimes we have to place obstacles in front of ourselves in order to exercise that muscle. And I remember the reason I'm bringing this up is because it was one of the lessons I learned from you back as a student 15 years ago, that you need to have that freedom is not freedom without limitation, which sounds counterintuitive. But you can't have absolute freedom because infinity itself is an obstacle to freedom, to that creativity. Do you still believe that, or do you not remember saying that?
No, that opens up a number of other questions. Some people would stress that, I suppose, that creativity has to do with the solving of problems, and as you put it, overcoming obstacles. And certainly in actor training, we work, many of us work with the concept of the power of the obstacle to engender decisive action, original action. But then I suppose the other side of the coin is another question. How intentional is creativity? How purposeful is it? Because we know that many great discoveries have been made by chance, by accident. And many discoveries, I think, the microwave perhaps has occurred when someone was actually intending to do something else. Marcel Duchamp, the artist, spoke about the creative paradox. And in speaking about that, he said that in creating a work of art, or a work of art often results from the attained, which was not intended,
Hmm.
or the intended, which was not attained. And he used that paradox to suggest, to underline the accidental feature of some creativity. So there's an important dichotomy there between that which is intended and purposeful in the creative, and that which is perhaps unintended and accidental, and perhaps comes about through play or even idleness. That takes us back to whether or not a quiet space, a quiet, playful space, is conducive to creative acts.
Well, and perhaps it depends on the person or on the group, because certainly I know some people who are put in quiet places will simply drift off into them and not use it as a challenge to them, whereas some people will see a quiet place or alternatively a hustle bustle city as a driver to produce something, as a reaction. I can't help but not react to my current predicament, but some people would need one thing and some people would need the other. And I wonder, and I know we're kind of playing amateur armchair philosophers here and trying to define creativity, but it's fun. And I wonder if one of the definitions we're looking for is that creativity is being able to notice the accident when it happens and not just overlook it. Because I can imagine that whether in creating a play or in writing a novel or painting a painting or inventing a microwave, that there are countless steps between beginning and end where something wonderful occurs. But if no one's there to notice it, then it's simply overlooked until someone else finds the same path. And is creativity simply the ability to step outside the process and notice and be able to have maybe the humility to change course and accept that what I intended is not what I'm going to attain?
Yeah, there is certainly the so-called aha moment or the breakthrough moment where a person perhaps gains insight, which maybe also is related to judgment. Oh, I've actually stumbled upon something really important here. As I spun this saucer idly on the table of the restaurant, I've discovered something about the laws of motion. I think there is actually a well-known discovery in physics that came about having to do with the laws of motion or inertia or something of that nature, that had to do with the playful manipulation of a saucer on a tabletop. But yes, having the power of insight and of judgment to know that this is a significantly creative moment, I think is an important consideration when we talk about creativity. It isn't all play, perhaps. It isn't all spontaneity, accident. There are intellectual factors such as judgment and insight that are part of the process.
Are these different factors, whether it's the playful child and the knowing adult, say, if these are different archetypes that live within all of us, for example, the child who will spin the plate and the adult who will notice when that spinning plate means something or can be taken to mean something. We talk about having these people within all of us. We talk about having these archetypes. And I wonder if that's a fruitful, helpful way to look at not only creativity, but what it means to be human, or are we missing the point that creators and human beings are integrated wholes that can't be broken down into one thing or another? In other words, that I'm playing as well as noticing at the same time, that I don't do one and then the other, that by definition of being human, I'm a multitasker, and that when I'm spinning the plate, I'm also noticing the plate. And if I'm trying to close down one thing, that I might be missing the fullness of what it means to be human. Or, and I know this is true just on a practical level, there are times I need to shut down or ignore certain parts of my subconscious or certain parts of my inner dialogue because it's not helpful to my creative process or to this conversation or you name it. I guess I'm talking about this balance between, creating silos in an individual and these archetypes, or treating the individual as a whole. And I don't know if there's a truth to be found, but how do you respond to that?
Lots of people, Picasso, the famous international educator Ken Robinson, they speak about, Picasso said, we are all artists. The problem is that we become adults and we cease to be artists. Ken Robinson talks about how educational systems, in their insistence on the concept of the right, being right, has stifled the freedom that young people should have to be wrong, and to be experimenters in the best sense of the word. So, yes, I think some kind of, in order for us to be complete human beings, there probably has to be some balance between freedom and restraint or control. We'll be most creative, I think. I think most people would agree to this. We'll be most creative if we have a kind of childlike freedom to play, but have also perhaps a more adult sense of purposefulness, of intention, and intellectual capacity to recognize when something really significant has happened. You did mention earlier, I think in one sentence, you mentioned the individual and the group. And this does affect, I think, this distinction between the individual and the group does affect, or provide us with one way of thinking about creativity. Because the creative is a kind of, I think, modern post-Renaissance concept, and from the Renaissance onward, we were given this sort of model of the individual genius, the Leonardo, the Isaac Newton,
who signed their names on their paintings, and there was a time when we didn't do that. There was a time when artists would never put their name on their work. It didn't, because you aren't the work. The work is being channeled through you. Right.
Yeah, and I think for probably for 2 or 3 centuries, we thought about creativity in relationship to individual genius. The creator who is divinely inspired to bring about great and unforeseen things. In the latter part of the 20th century, and certainly I think in our time now, most people tend to think about creativity more as a collaborative process, recognizing that the world's problems are too complex for one mind. Most thinkers about creativity, I think, espouse the value of collaborative approaches. The field of architecture, for example, has moved in this direction. Certainly information technology has moved in this direction.
It's a very interesting concept, this dilemma between the individual and the group, which is very much a modern dilemma that human beings didn't have to face so much in most of our history. And a really interesting story to be told here is that of, you just said information technology, but also coding and software development and the whole world of Silicon Valley. And I mention this because there's a website which is used by coders and programmers called GitHub. And it's not been around for that long, but essentially it is a community where people, or millions of programmers around the world, go to work on open source projects. So let's just say you need a new program talking about microwaves to make your microwave work better, and you want to make this program for everyone to use in everyone's home. So you can go to GitHub and say, okay, here's my idea. Here's the basics of what I need to do. Everyone have at her. And within the space of sometimes a few hours or a few days, you can have a fully fledged microwave oven program that no one has ever considered before, and that has been built by 10,000 people on all parts of the globe. And no single one person can say they own it. You may own the final product because you're the commissioner of it, but you're the commissioner of the program in the same way that someone commissioned a Leonardo da Vinci painting, right? Or a Michelangelo back in the day. Yes, you own the painting and you probably were the one to feel most proud about it, but you didn't make it. You made it because you made it possible. And I think that nobody who works in programming thinks that there is one individual genius who will solve all problems, because it just doesn't work that way. And I think that can teach us something about very real world practical creativity on a massive scale. Now, of course, some of the most wonderful things that are, Facebook, for example, was initially created by one guy and a few other people who were helping him, but it was the vision and the product of the labor of one person. But Facebook today is the product of countless man hours put into a product that was spread around the globe. And I don't know if this is necessarily translatable into, say, the theater, but I think that we're missing the point if we think it's impossible. I think we're missing the point that creativity is housed in some kind of collective humanity, because human beings are collective animals, because we operate socially.
I think one of the wonderful things about collaborative work is that not only does collaborative work often result in the creation of new knowledge, but during the process, the insights of one particular individual are enriched and extended by those of others. And so not only do we end up with new knowledge, but the capacity of each of the collaborating individuals is probably enriched and extended during the process in ways that will extend beyond the process of this particular project. I mean, it's interesting. You and I met through my work in the theater and your study of theater. And theater is an interesting field because, my focus was mainly on the work of the actor. Usually we think of the work of the actor as fundamentally being solitary. He has to generate a performance. She has to interpret a role. For my part, I think of the actor as a creative artist, not as a mere interpreter of someone else's work, but someone who creates something original in any given theater project. But at the same time, theater is a communal art, a collaborative art form. We never, I shouldn't say never, but it strikes me as almost impossible that a person would work entirely alone in the making of a theater performance and the performing of it. So this kind of continuum from solitary work through collaborative and communal work, it comes sharply into focus when we think about and practice theater.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this placement on the continuum between the solitary and the group, and I think that culturally we're predisposed to one end of that spectrum, and not for necessarily good reasons. And we miss the opportunity to not only feed off the group, but contribute back to that group. And we may be doing that as individuals, but we're not necessarily aware of it. And in our daily lives, not just working in the theater or working as creative people, but our functioning occurs as a part of our community. And so it's a mistake to think that our creativity is exclusive to some, internal magic that is within us. That isn't necessarily untrue, that there's some kind of internal engine, but it's only actualized and real in relation to other people, I think. There's something that you hinted at in the first sentence of your first answer about your own personal reflection. And I did want to talk about your journey over the past year or so with cancer, because I know that the reason I wanted to ask you this question is because I know that you've chosen to be reflective of it in a way that a lot of people would choose to either attack or retreat, to simply deal with the problem and tackle it and get it over with, or pretend it's not happening. Whereas you took almost a Bruce Lee approach to embrace what was happening to you over that year. And I wanted to ask you, obviously, how that fits into creativity, which I think for you it does. But what was that journey like, and where are you at with it now?
Well, I'm interested in your, your take on how I responded to that challenge, because I didn't plan any particular approach to it. I had quite a bit of support around me. My wife works in the field of cancer support, and so she was a tremendous ballast as I navigated these waters. But I didn't set out in a conscious way to take any particular approach to it, other than, I suppose, to be positive and to take as much as possible a half glass full attitude toward it. Um, but it's difficult to be absolutely intentional about something that's so shocking. When you're a person like me who thinks that he's never been ill in his life, really, never seriously ill, and is in astonishingly good health for a person of his age. I come from a large family, 7 children, a rural Maritimers, good stock, and among my siblings, I was told that I was in fabulous health for my age. So it's a shock to realize that you have a condition that is potentially life-threatening. How did that play out? Well, of course, I underwent treatment, and the treatment wears you out, wears you down, and you do spend you don't have a lot of energy to do the kinds of things you were perhaps accustomed to doing. And so I did find myself occupying what I'll call a reflective zone quite frequently. Not a depressed zone. I didn't feel particularly depressed by the journey I had to undertake, and it's been about a year now. I had support. I had love. I have, I think, an essential basic optimism, but I did find myself reflecting on my life, on the journey that brought me to this place.
You're a reflective person already, though.
Yes.
I think that you already are attracted to that quiet place. So,
Well, I am. I said I was one of 7 children, and I was the middle of 7 children, 3 on either side of me in a very noisy household. And so I found that this position of middle child was a really good point of observation of what was going on around me. And I listened a lot. And I was naturally somewhat introverted and observant and reflective. Yeah, that's part of who I am, part of my nature.
So then what was it about, if that's naturally who you are, or how you respond to obstacles or to your life's journey, then what was it about being diagnosed with cancer and going through that journey were you reflective in a different way? Were you reflective about different things? What was the difference, and what was the reason for that, do you think?
I don't know, but I also am retired from full-time work, although I continue to do some work. But I had time on my hands, and I did find that that reflection often amounted to reclaiming in my mind and in my imagination whole chapters of my life that I had not thought about for a long time. And I continue to do this. The year I was 11, or when I some aspects of my life are of real interest to me as I look back. I grew up in on the edge of a village, a fairly remote village in eastern Nova Scotia. And I grew up at a time when my family were still living the way their people had lived since the early 19th century. You know, when I was born there, we didn't live with electricity or running water. The school was 2 miles away. And then when I was 5 years old, that all ended, and we moved to town. And we were part of a kind of post-World War II exodus from the country to the town because there was an economic depression following the war, and families were on the move. And so I was reflecting on this actually recently, how interesting it was to be part of that exodus, and even at the age of 5, how acutely aware I was of the fact that something really monumental was happening in my life, right? Because I remember it was a fearful experience for me. The only concept I had of what a town was from my school reader, where I saw that all of the houses were white and had white picket fences, and they all looked the same. And I remember feeling terrified that I wouldn't be able to find my way home from school because I wouldn't know which house was mine. So I recently reflected on that particular journey in my bigger journey, which of course is made up of many, many journeys. And there have been quite interesting twists and turns to my own particular path that I'm curious about. Yeah, that's all part of my reflection.
One thing that Brian said in this conversation so far that stuck with me is the idea that the need to be right has stifled the need to experiment and sometimes to get it wrong. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about how being creative requires us to face our fears. We talk about deeper ideas of creativity, and we even talk about virtual reality. All of this is coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On.
If you could, here's what I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask if you could take all of that reflection and go back to the boy at 5 years old, or another boy or girl when they're, say, 12, and tell them something that would be important for them, that would help them overcome obstacles. I know that we wouldn't necessarily want to do that because you have to live and learn for yourself. We don't need to necessarily have a hand in everything that we do. But if you could, not boil it down, but if there was something that you could say to Brian when he was 5, what would you, Brian, today say?
You know, the French actor Gérard Depardieu said he was born in poverty, and he said that being born in poverty was the best training he could have for being an actor, because he had nothing and had to imagine everything. I wasn't born in poverty, but we had, as I described, a very simple life lived in intimate relationship with the natural world. And I believe that as a result of those conditions, I lived imaginatively. I really used my imagination and had to use my imagination. There were few distractions. To trust in and believe in one's imagination and something that's intimately associated with it, I believe one's inner life, is important if we're going to have a full and meaningful life. And I know that working with young actors, and you know, I worked primarily as a teacher, coach, I found repeatedly that what young actors most appreciated about the work I did with them was that I had some capacity to help them become more knowing of and intimate with their inner life. So I guess I would say that to the 5-year-old, keep trusting this connection with inner life and the imagination. When I mentioned that we had left the country when I was 5 and moved to town, but my parents, they didn't quite trust the town, so we didn't live in town. We lived outside of town so that we could be safe
So you
from
could find your way home too.
yeah, so I could find my way home. It's funny you should mention that because that's what I'm coming to. But I think they wanted to keep us safe from the evil influences of town, so initially we lived in a farmhouse in a village outside of town. And I had to walk home from school by myself because being in one of the lower grades, I was released earlier than my older brothers. And I walked about, I think, a mile and a half, 2 miles home along a country road. On the way, I loved these walks. I sometimes felt lonely on these walks, and I think when I first started walking alone, I was a little bit frightened. I thought that I'm all alone and something could happen to me. I believe I had that kind of vague sensation, but very quickly I learned to love these walks home. And I loved the fact that I passed through wonderful fields and underneath great elm trees and past a brook. And at one point, when the road rose up to higher ground, there was a pond. And that spring that I was doing that walk from school, I observed the whole life cycle of a frog in that pond. I saw the frog's eggs, and then I saw tadpoles, and then I saw the tadpoles gradually transforming into frogs, and it was like a wonderful kind of science lesson in pond life. And so I guess I would, looking back on that kid walking home, I would say, good for you for enjoying it and taking what you could from it. The walk home from the Plymouth School is really a beautiful memory for me.
It raises the question for me, this idea of knowing. You know, you've talked a lot already about the importance that you as a teacher imparted on your students of to know yourself and to know, to notice and to know, and not to determine, but to just understand where things are coming from or where they might be coming from, or just that they are within you, and not without judgment, but just as a noticing. And I think you spend a lot of your work and your time trying to know, trying to reflect. And you know, you looking at the entire life cycle of a frog to a child trying to know the situation of life, to trying to understand the situation of life. And it raises a very interesting philosophical question, which has, you know, been with humanity since we've probably been aware of our own mortality, which is it better to know or not to know? Is it better to explore or not to explore? I think it was Socrates who said and is often quoted as saying, an unexamined life is not worth living. There are many people who don't examine their lives having a pretty good time, you know, whatever they're doing, and would say that those who know are cursed with the knowledge from the tree of knowledge, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I just want to just put that question to you, maybe in a more nuanced way, and just to say, is it better to know or not to know? Is it better to reflect or not to reflect? Because with reflection does come difficulty, challenge, sometimes even pain.
As long as I can remember, the world seemed like a perplexing place to me, sometimes a difficult place. And I, from a very early age, found myself asking why about many different things, including about myself, why I was so afraid, why I couldn't resist crying, why I couldn't accomplish something that my older brother could. I actually was blessed to have a brother who 2 years older than I, who was very curious about many things, and I kind of followed him around when I was very young, and a curiosity about the world was piqued partly through association with him. And now when he and I get together and talk, there's still a lot of questions in the air. Peter Brook, the great British director and educator, speaking about creativity, said that in being creative, if we wish to be creative, we have to face our fears. We have to experience risk, or nothing of value will occur. And I think there's some truth in that. Education, the word education at its root means to draw out or to lead out. And I've always thought that as a teacher, my one important role I had was to draw out of the individual something that wanted to be drawn out or needed to be drawn out that was perhaps not yet quite formed. So the eliciting aspect of education is what always interested me, and that's a negotiated process. It's very different from in which the teacher and the learner, I believe, are equal partners, and in which, a process in which I think the teacher stands to learn as much as does the student. And therefore, when you come to the whole question of assessment, that's a negotiated process too. Mm-hmm. That's very different from a kind of one-directional idea of the instructor.
Like imparting knowledge.
Mm-hmm. The person who instructs, the person who imparts. I've never been much interested in that kind of, it wasn't my skill set. I had a small capacity to draw things out of people, which I guess actually begins with helping people become aware of their inner space and its power. Yes, this can be difficult, but if we want to be creative performers, it's I think essential because in performing, in theater performance, in acting, the self is the instrument. We don't get to play a violin, an object that exists apart from us. We play with and within ourselves, through ourselves.
Just to add to that, one of your interests is mask and the working with a mask and what a mask does to the body and to the mind and to the performer. And one lesson that I drew from that years ago was that a first impression of an actor with a mask is probably similar to what a musician would do with an instrument, to play the mask, to do something with a mask, to make it the performed object, and I'm just the player, the one pulling the strings. But really, the mask is simply a way to draw out, as you say, something from within, to enable the performer maybe to do something he or she wouldn't do otherwise. If I put a mask on, or a clown nose, or even just a piece of costume, I may feel enabled to inhabit a different space. And with a different space comes a different mindset. And what's interesting about this is there's a virtual reality lab in Barcelona in Spain, and they do some really interesting work. Some of the work includes embodiment, the idea of embodiment. And there's one article, I think it was in the New Yorker, about the writer went to this VR lab in Barcelona and put on the headset, and the lab had done a full body scan of him. And they'd also done a body scan of what they assumed Sigmund Freud would look like. And in the exercise, he went into a world through the VR headset and embodied and literally stepped into himself, and then literally stepped out of himself, and then stepped into Sigmund Freud, right? The archetypal, quintessential psychoanalyst, and had a conversation between himself and Sigmund Freud, each played by himself. And then, of course, left this experience, watched the dialogue happen after the fact, and realized there were a lot of things he learned from it. and from a person who he didn't realize was even him at some points, by simply embodying something else. And it sounds like this sort of mystical idea of being carried away by a character or by a mask. You are yourself in the mask, and he was himself in Sigmund Freud, but he was enabled to embody, and maybe the opposite of embody, but take his mind and put it somewhere else. Take his shoes or take his feet and put them in a different set of shoes, or reside at a different address for a while. And I think that was a very, clever way to show that we are whoever we would like to embody ourselves as at this moment. And my learning can come from myself. I can be my own teacher, perhaps, to draw out myself from a different vantage point, perhaps. Is that, well, first of all, do you think that's an accurate assessment of what mask is? But also, do you think that that's an important perspective of creativity?
Yes, and just to follow on something that you just said, I do think that in the training of actors, the ultimate goal is that the actor should become his or her own coach. But the mask is a long story, and we could have a long discussion about the use of masks in actor training and my own work with masks over the years. So we'll try to open up what is really a complex subject and not do it any disservice by talking about it relatively briefly or sketchily. The work I've done with mask is from a tradition of mask work that was introduced early in the 20th century by Jacques Copeau in France, and which was then inherited by a number of his followers, one of whom was his nephew Michel Saint-Denis, who became a great theater educator and who founded a number of important theater schools in Western Europe and ultimately North America. He was the founding inspiration for the Juilliard School in New York City, and he was the founding inspiration for our own National Theatre School of Canada. And one of his great protégés and later great teachers was Pierre Lefebvre, whom I had the good fortune of encountering around about 1980, and I learned a great deal from him. Pierre guided me in my own interest in and study of mask. The basic idea of mask work and actor training for me is that the mask exists to stretch and expand our understanding of who we might be as performers. We're all, personality is to some extent constructed, and we are, as human beings, somewhat limited by conditions of identity, of socialization, and habit. And it's true, I believe, that we can become somewhat fixed in habitual ways of behaving and responding, and we can carry these habitual patterns with us into the realm of performance. And I think one of the mask has many lessons, but one of its main purposes is to dissolve the barriers that can be created by our habitual understandings of who we are. And so we put on a mask and we look at it, perhaps. We see it, and we see that it represents an entity that is very different from how we think of ourselves. We put it on, and because now our face is covered, we're encouraged to occupy a deeper place in ourselves. we reach down into ourselves. But at the same time, there's an opposite energy that encourages us to rise up and meet the mask and fill it. It's difficult to explain the process in words, but the process involves embodying the mask and allowing one's body and breath to adjust to what the mask brings to us. It's like a meeting. It's the point at which one's inner life meets outer life. And that's a really important meeting point, creative point in acting. The juncture of inner and outer life. And so we find a way of being, a way of breathing, a way of occupying space, a way of moving and of using gesture and expression that is different from our habitual ones. So it is the self at a new address. It's not like we leave ourselves behind. The energies of inner life rise up to embody the mask, which asks of us a mode of expression, physical life that is different from our own. And during the course of this training, we can play many different masks. And in the process, discover that we can be performers of wider range than we might have imagined. We can be louder than we normally are. We can be cruder. We can be more cruel, funnier, although there's no intention that the masks should require us to be funny. That's not in the purpose of the mask. But we can expand our range of who we are or who we might be in performance.
This juncture that you mentioned, that critical point between inner life and outer life, the meeting of me and my mask, for example, is it a corollary to, or even maybe the same thing of meeting two different people who are able to come together and listen and be creative together? Is there a corollary here?
Well, maybe there is. And, we speak about, in working in mask, we speak about the hit we have with a particular mask. And even the hit we have with a particular mask on a particular day, because we're not precisely the same person day after day. We're slightly different in our mood and in our energy and in our state of being each day of our lives. So it sometimes happens that we have a particularly powerful hit with a particular mask. And that's a meeting of real significance. That might be a mask that opens us up to aspects of ourselves that were hidden. And this can be a joyous thing. You mentioned earlier, you asked the question earlier whether or not Socrates had it right. Well, it can be joyous to know or to feel that you're that you can be a larger character than you ever thought you might be. Large, I mean that you can occupy more space than you ever imagined you could occupy. Or that you can be more foolish and childlike than you normally allow yourself to be. This can be liberating. The mask, therefore, is a kind of technique. It's a tool. I always like to think that technique exists to liberate the imagination, to set the imagination free. The mask is that kind of tool. It's intended to free us.
It sounds like what we're talking about, whether it's mask or performance or creativity for theater, is all applicable to anybody's life. And I don't mean to say that everybody should go to theater school and have a great time to learn more about yourself, but the principles that are at play here about creativity and that meeting point, that juncture, and that crossover between inner life and outer life, and the dissecting and maybe even disintegrating of our everyday habits is something that anybody could be enriched by and liberated by. And I don't know how that would be, but I assume that one of the key features of it is something you mentioned earlier that you've always been good at, which is listening, is the ability to let someone in to you, or let a conversation in, or let a book in, or a movie, or whatever, rather than just keep it at arm's length and maybe study it, maybe learn something about it, but don't let it in. Because letting something in has an alchemical property to change you. You may be different tomorrow if you let that thing in. And that is dangerous, because we want to be, and this is again going back to an earlier thought, we want to be these individuals who may have some inherent genius. And if we let something in, it might dilute it or change it. And we may never be the same again and never have that wonderful, perfect mixture that we think we have. And I think that that's a powerful thought for artists or non-artists, but anyone who has a creative bone in their body, which I think is everybody. I don't think I've met anybody who isn't creative.
I think a lot of theater work and training for the theater has to do with the dissolving of human barriers, and in that sense, it's a very healthy pursuit. I had a friend when we were young and were studying acting who used to say to me that it was just great because at least we didn't have to pay for a shrink. But theater training isn't therapy, acting isn't therapy, but there is something inherently healthy about this pursuit, because human beings are the subject of our investigation. And, as I mentioned before, our primary instrument in that investigation is our own humanity. So there's something, I feel blessed to have been introduced to this field and to have worked in this field for many years. There's another important thing that we shouldn't forget. I talked about the use of mask and what masks can do for the individual performer, but a whole other dimension of an actor's work and the training of an actor has to do with reciprocity. It has to do with inter-influence. It has to do with my relationship to the other and the back and forthness of acting. A really important aspect of our training has to do with, listening, with attending to the other, with responding and looking for the authentic response, dealing with what's right in front of you, concentrating on what's happening in the now, and knowing that we are in part who we are because of the influence of others.
It's funny because you say that acting and theater is not therapy, and nor is it religion, but it not only draws from both, but can provide help with both. And I by religion, I think the therapy part is obvious. By religion, I mean the search for enlightenment, for example. Well, to focus on the now and to be attendant to what's happening in the moment and to be reciprocal to what's happening to me from you or from the ant that's walking on there's no ant, by the way, but to the ant that's walking on the carpet or whatever. To notice these things, I think, is crucial to understanding not only what it means to be human, but what it means to transcend some of the baggage that comes with being human, to transcend some of the habits that we develop and the coping mechanisms that we've had to build over time, the coping mechanisms that you had to build by, living on the edge to living on the edge of town to trying to find your way home in a very confusing Nova Scotian village back in your day. So I think that there are critical lessons for all of us, but I think that that's why sometimes theater is called a priesthood, and I think that it's not too far off, and it doesn't have to be mystical to be true to a certain spirituality. Last question, Brian. What have we not talked about here? What just something that you if we had another hour you'd really want to dig into? What's something that we have not addressed that you think we should have?
Well, yeah, and it's partly related perhaps to theater and my work as a theater educator and theater artist, but it has broader application than that, I think, and it's a greater interest than that. That is the telling of stories, because theater is essentially a storytelling medium, and the stories that we tell, the stories that need to be told, the stories that can't be told, the stories that are waiting to be told, all of that has a great deal to do with what the theater is. And in the making of theater, in our engagement with theater, we get to tell our own stories. Even while we, as actors, tell the story of the play, we also, in some way, tell the story of our own lives as we do that, or aspects of our own lives. So I think that storytelling is a really important dimension of human culture, and in a world which seems now overcome with many untruths and lies, where lying, in fact, often appears to be acceptable in public discourse, the telling of stories and the truth of stories is of really grave importance.
Well, Brian, your wife is about to walk in, so I think that means the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
To learn more about Brian Smith, please go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes and find a way to get in touch with me on social media or by email to let me know what you think of this episode or any other. And of course, to give me your suggestions for future episodes and future guests to have on this show. Now, your quote of the week is something that Brian brought up in our conversation from Pablo Picasso. Every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once we grow up. Thanks, as always, to Andrea Wetstein, our composer, and special thanks for this episode to Brian Smith for opening up his home in Toronto and giving us the chance to record. Next week, we're talking with Jodie McPherson in Calgary about the book Quiet by Susan Cain. I'll see you then.